When my husband died, I thought the hardest part was the grief. I was wrong. The real battle began when his children discovered our joint savings account had $400,000 in it, and they believed half of it belonged to them. My name is Helen, and at 63 years old, I learned that losing your husband is just the beginning of losing everything else. You know that feeling when you think you understand your life, and then something happens that makes you realize you were living in a completely different world than everyone around you? That's where my story begins. Robert and I had 25 beautiful years together. It was my second marriage, his third, and we both knew what we were getting into, or at least we thought we did. When you marry later in life, you bring more than just love to the table. You bring children from previous relationships, mortgages, retirement accounts, and decades of financial habits that don't always mesh perfectly. But Robert and I, we worked hard to blend our lives together, including our money. I remember the day we opened our joint savings account. I was 52, working as a school administrator, and Robert was 55, managing a small construction company. We sat in that sterile bank office, and the young financial advisor kept asking us if we were sure we wanted everything joint. Most couples your age keep some accounts separate, she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Robert looked at me, took my hand, and said, "We're building something together from here on out." That was Robert, always thinking about our future, our shared dreams. Over the years, we were careful with money, not cheap, mind you, but thoughtful. We both had been through divorces, and we understood that financial security wasn't just about having money, it was about having peace of mind. Every month, we'd sit at our kitchen table with our coffee and pay the bills together. I'd handle the household expenses, he'd manage the business accounts, and together we'd decide how much to put into savings. The money came from everywhere and nowhere special, the way it does when you're disciplined about it. My teaching salary, his construction profits, the small inheritance I received when my mother passed, the money from selling his old house when he moved in with me. We lived modestly, drove used cars until they died, and took vacations to state parks instead of Europe. But we were building something. That joint account grew slowly but steadily, $50,000, then $100,000, then $200,000. You know that feeling when you check your bank balance and feel genuinely proud of what you've accomplished? That's how I felt every month when our statement arrived. Robert would always say, "Helen, look what we did together." Not what he did, not what I did, but what we did. That distinction would become more important than I ever imagined. His children from his previous marriages visited occasionally. Thomas, 41, worked in insurance and lived 2 states away with his wife and teenage daughter. Carol, 38, was a nurse practitioner who'd always been polite but distant. And James, 35, the youngest, who managed a restaurant and seemed to resent that his father had found happiness with someone who wasn't his mother. They were pleasant enough during holidays and birthday gatherings, but I always sensed an underlying tension, like they were waiting for something. Robert tried to maintain relationships with all of them, but it wasn't easy. His first marriage had ended badly, and his second wasn't much better. The children carried those wounds, and I understood that. I had my own daughter, Patricia, from my first marriage, and she had her own complicated feelings about my relationship with Robert. These blended family dynamics are never simple, but Robert and I focused on our life together and tried to be respectful of everyone's feelings. What I didn't realize was how much his children resented our joint financial decisions. To them, every dollar Robert contributed to our shared savings was a dollar taken away from their eventual inheritance. Every home improvement we made together, every vacation we took, every investment we made was viewed through the lens of what it meant for them later. But Robert and I weren't thinking about later. We were living our lives, building our security, planning for our retirement together. The savings account wasn't just growing from our regular contributions. Robert was smart about money in ways I was still learning. He'd research investments, move money between high yield savings accounts, and even convinced me to put some funds into conservative mutual funds. By our 20th anniversary, we had accumulated almost $300,000. By our 23rd, it was $350,000. The number itself wasn't as important as what it represented. Two people working together, sacrificing together, planning together. What I didn't know was that Robert's children had been watching our account grow. Thomas worked in insurance, so he understood finances better than his siblings. During one of their visits, I overheard him asking Robert about estate planning and protecting the family's assets. At the time, I thought he was just being responsible, encouraging his father to have proper legal documents in place. I had no idea he was calculating how much money his father was allowing me to access. The irony is that Robert and I had done our estate planning. We'd updated our wills, established power of attorney documents, and made sure everything was legal and clear. Robert left his children some specific items: his tools to James, his father's watch to Thomas, some jewelry that had belonged to their grandmother to Carol. But the bulk of our shared assets, including that joint savings account, remained with me. We were married. We had built this life together, and legally and morally, that money was as much mine as it was his. But legal and moral don't always align with emotional, especially when it comes to adult children and their parents' money. Robert's health had been declining gradually over our last few years together. Nothing dramatic, just the usual aches and pains of a man in his 70s who'd worked construction his whole life. He had diabetes, some heart issues, and chronic back pain, but he managed it all well. We both assumed we'd have more time. You always assume you'll have more time. The heart attack came suddenly on a Thursday morning in March. One moment he was reading the newspaper and complaining about the weather, and the next moment he was on our kitchen floor, and I was calling 911 with shaking hands. He died at the hospital 3 hours later, holding my hand, with his children driving frantically from their respective cities to say goodbye to a father who was already gone. You know that feeling when your entire world shifts in an instant and you realize that nothing will ever be the same again? That's grief. It's not just sadness, it's the complete reorganization of reality. Every plan you made, every assumption you held, every little daily routine gets shattered and has to be rebuilt from scratch. I thought that was the hard part. I thought burying my husband and learning to live alone again would be the biggest challenge of my life. I was so naive. 3 days after the funeral, after the casseroles had been delivered and the flower arrangements had begun to wilt, Thomas knocked on my door. He was still wearing his funeral suit, and he had a manila folder in his hands. "Helen," he said, "we need to talk about Dad's finances." That's when I realized they had no idea what Robert and I had actually agreed on. They had no idea that our money was our money, not his money that I happened to have access to. They had no idea that 25 years of marriage and joint financial planning meant something legally and practically. They had spent years watching that account balance grow, and they had been waiting for the day when they could claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The real battle wasn't going to be with grief. It was going to be with family. And I was about to learn that sometimes the people who should support you through the hardest time of your life are the very people who see that hardness as an opportunity. Thomas stood in my living room, still smelling faintly of funeral flowers and aftershave, with that manila folder clutched in his hands like it contained the answers to everything. Carol and James flanked him on either side of my couch, the same couch where Robert and I used to watch our evening shows together. The irony wasn't lost on me that they had arranged themselves like they were conducting an intervention. "Helen, we know this is a difficult time," Thomas began, his insurance agent voice smooth and practiced. "But we need to discuss the financial situation. Dad's assets, the accounts, the house. We need to understand what the estate looks like so we can move forward appropriately. I poured myself a cup of coffee with hands that were steadier than I felt. You know that feeling when you're walking into a conversation that you know is going to change everything, but you're not sure how? That's exactly where I was. Thomas, your father and I discussed all of this years ago. Everything is in order. Well, that's what we want to understand, Carol said, leaning forward. She had always been the most direct of the three. We know Dad had that savings account with you, and we're assuming that now that he's gone, it gets split according to his will. The words hit me like cold water. Split according to his will. They actually believed that our joint savings account, money we had saved together, planned together, invested together for over 2 decades, was somehow their inheritance. I think there might be some confusion here, I said slowly. James, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Look, Helen, we're not trying to be difficult. We know you and Dad were happy together, but that account has almost $400,000 in it. Half of that was Dad's money, and we think it's only fair that it gets distributed among his children. Half of that was Dad's money. The phrase echoed in my mind. After 25 years of marriage, after building a life together, after every monthly budget meeting at our kitchen table, they saw our shared financial life as something that could be neatly divided down the middle. They saw me as someone who had been temporarily allowed access to their father's money. The account is a joint account, I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. That means it belongs to both of us equally. Now that Robert has passed, it belongs entirely to me. That's how joint accounts work legally. Thomas opened his manila folder and pulled out some papers. We've been doing some research, and we think there might be legal grounds to challenge this, especially if it can be shown that Dad contributed more to the account than you did. The audacity of it took my breath away. They wanted to audit 25 years of my marriage. They wanted to go through every deposit, every contribution, every financial decision Robert and I had made together, and determine what percentage belonged to whom. They wanted to treat our life like a business partnership that was being dissolved. Thomas, I'm not going to sit here and justify my marriage to you, I said, standing up. Your father and I built that savings together. We made every decision about it together. The money is legally and rightfully mine. But morally, Carol interjected, don't you think his children should inherit something substantial from their father? Morally. There was that word that would haunt me for months to come. They were going to make this about morality, about what kind of person I was, about whether I was greedy or generous, selfish or fair. They were going to make me defend not just my legal rights, but my character. Your father left you items in his will, I reminded them. He made his wishes very clear. James laughed bitterly. A toolbox and some old watches? Helen, be serious. We're talking about our father's life savings. No, I said firmly. We're talking about our life savings, mine and Robert's, together. That's when I realized they saw me as temporary. In their minds, I had been a companion for their father's later years, someone who had been allowed to share in his life, but not someone who had actually built a life with him. They saw our marriage as something that had happened to their father, not something their father had chosen and invested in and prioritized. After they left that evening, I sat alone in my quiet house and tried to process what had just happened. 3 days after burying my husband, his children had essentially told me that they intended to fight me for the money we had saved together. They were going to make my grief about their inheritance. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Janet Morrison, who had handled our estate planning. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law and estate issues. She had seen these family conflicts before. Helen, I need you to understand something very clearly, Janet said after I explained the situation. Legally, You are absolutely in the right. Joint accounts with rights of survivorship automatically transfer to the surviving account holder. There is no ambiguity here. That money is yours. The relief I felt hearing those words was enormous. So they can't do anything? I didn't say that, Janet cautioned. They can try to challenge it. They can claim undue influence. They can question Robert's mental capacity when decisions were made. They can try to prove that the account was funded primarily by Robert's separate property. Most of these challenges would be unsuccessful, but they could be expensive and time-consuming to defend against. Expensive and time-consuming. Those words would come to define the next several months of my life. Even being right, even having the law on my side, wouldn't protect me from the stress and cost of defending what was rightfully mine. What do you recommend? I asked. Document everything, Janet said. Bank statements, contribution records, any emails or conversations you and Robert had about financial planning. And prepare yourself for this to get ugly. Money brings out the worst in people, and grief makes it even worse. She was right about it getting ugly. Within a week, Thomas had hired his own attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Peterson who specialized in estate disputes. Peterson sent a letter to Janet requesting financial records going back 10 years. They wanted to see every deposit, every withdrawal, every transaction that had built our savings account. But knowing my legal rights and living peacefully were two very different things. The stress of the conflict began affecting every aspect of my life. I couldn't sleep through the night. Every phone ring made my heart race, wondering if it was another legal demand or family confrontation. I stopped going to the grocery store at certain times because I was afraid of running into people who might have heard about the family dispute. The worst part was how quickly the family drama spread through our community. Robert and I had been active in our church, involved in local volunteer organizations, known by neighbors and shop owners. Suddenly, everywhere I went, I could feel people watching me, wondering about the widow who was fighting her stepchildren over money. Carol, who lived locally, began what I can only describe as a pressure campaign. She would show up at my house unannounced, always with some pretext, returning a dish from after the funeral, bringing mail that had been delivered to her address by mistake, checking to see how I was managing alone. But the real purpose was always the same: to wear me down, to make me feel guilty, to convince me to do the right thing and share the inheritance. Helen, I'm worried about you, she said during one of these visits. Living alone in this big house, dealing with all of Dad's affairs by yourself. Maybe it would be easier if you moved somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable. We could help you find a nice apartment, and then the house could be sold and the proceeds distributed fairly. The house. I hadn't even thought about the fact that they might want the house too. The house that Robert and I had shared for 15 years, where we had hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties, where we had painted the kitchen together and planted the garden. They saw it as another asset to be divided, not as my home. You know that feeling when you realize that people you thought cared about you actually see you as an obstacle to something they want? It's devastating. It makes you question every interaction you've ever had with them, every holiday dinner, every birthday card, every hug at the funeral. Had they always been calculating what they would inherit? Had they always seen me as temporary? The emotional manipulation was constant and exhausting. James called me crying one evening, talking about how disappointed his father would be to see the family fighting. Dad always wanted us to take care of each other, he sobbed. He wouldn't want this conflict. He'd want you to be generous with his children. Thomas took a different approach, appealing to my practical side. He had run calculations, he said. If I kept all the money, I'd be financially comfortable but not wealthy. If I shared it with them, I'd still have enough to live on, and they could use their portions to help with their children's college expenses, to pay off mortgages, to secure their own futures. Wasn't that what Robert would have wanted? The pressure was relentless. Every day brought a new argument for why I should give them money that was legally mine. They made me feel selfish for wanting to keep what Robert and I had saved together. They made me feel like I was betraying their father's memory by not supporting his children financially. They made me question whether I was being a good person or a greedy widow. The community pressure was almost worse than the family pressure. Our small town loved drama, and a widow fighting her stepchildren over money was the kind of story that spread quickly and got embellished in the telling. At the post office, I overheard two women discussing how I was keeping the children's inheritance. At church, people who had been warm and friendly before began giving me polite but distant smiles. Some people, thankfully, understood the situation better. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, whose own husband had died 5 years earlier, stopped by with a casserole and some advice. "Helen, don't you let them bully you," she said firmly. "I went through something similar with my late husband's sister. Family thinks grief makes you weak and vulnerable, and they think they can take advantage. You hold your ground." But for every Mrs. Patterson, there seemed to be three people who thought I should just split the money and keep the peace. They couldn't understand that this wasn't about money. It was about respect, about acknowledging that my marriage had been real and meaningful, about recognizing that I had been Robert's partner, not just his companion. Then they brought in the one person I never expected. Robert's first wife, Janet, not my lawyer Janet, but James and Thomas's mother, called me on a Tuesday evening in April. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she had made some snide comments about Robert trading up when he married me. "Helen, I know we've had our differences," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "But I'm calling because I'm concerned about my children. They're struggling financially, especially with their own children to think about. Robert always said he wanted to provide for his kids, and I think keeping all that money is preventing him from doing that, even in death." The conversation was surreal. Robert's first wife calling to guilt me into giving away the money I had saved with her ex-husband. It was a level of family drama that I hadn't known existed outside of soap operas. "Janet, Robert, and I discussed our financial plans extensively," I told her. "He knew exactly how his assets would be distributed. If he had wanted his children to inherit more, he could have changed his will or kept separate accounts." "But did he really understand how much money was in that account?" she asked. Sometimes older men get confused about finances, especially when they're sick. There it was, the suggestion that Robert hadn't been mentally competent when he made financial decisions with me. They were preparing to claim that I had somehow manipulated or confused him into giving me access to their money. Just when I thought I was completely alone, an old friend showed me something that changed everything. Patricia, my own daughter, had been watching the family drama unfold with increasing anger. She lived across the country and couldn't provide much practical support, but she did some research that proved invaluable. "Mom, I've been looking into this online," she said during one of our nightly phone calls. This exact situation happens to widows all the time. There are support groups, legal resources, financial advisors who specialize in helping women protect their assets from family challenges. You're not alone in this, and you're not wrong to fight for what's yours. She sent me links to websites, forums where other widows shared their stories, legal articles about joint accounts and inheritance law. Reading these resources was like finding oxygen after months of suffocating. Other women had faced exactly what I was facing. Other women had been pressured, manipulated, and guilted by adult stepchildren who felt entitled to their parents' assets. Other women had been made to feel selfish for keeping what was legally and rightfully theirs. But the most important thing Patricia showed me was a forum post from a widow whose story was almost identical to mine. This woman, Margaret, had faced down her late husband's children and won. She had kept her joint savings account, sold her house on her own terms, and built a new life for herself without giving in to family pressure. At the end of her post, she had written something that stuck with me. They wanted me to choose between keeping my money and keeping the peace. I realized that people who would put me in that position weren't people whose opinion of me mattered. That night, for the first time since Robert's funeral, I slept through the night. I had a plan, but first I needed to do something that would shock them all. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. You know that feeling when you've been trying to solve a problem by being nice, by being reasonable, by hoping other people will suddenly develop consciences, and then you realize that the only solution is to stop playing by rules that only benefit them? That's where I found myself at 63 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and my checkbook, ready to take control of my own life. My first call was to Janet, my attorney. I want to move the money, I told her. Helen, that's not necessary. The account is legally yours. Moving it might actually look suspicious if they do decide to challenge. Janet, I don't care how it looks to them anymore, I interrupted. I care about how it feels to me. Right now, every time I think about that money, I think about their accusations and their demands and their calculations of how much belongs to whom. I want it in an account that has never had Robert's name on it. I want it to be unquestionably, undeniably mine. There was a pause. Okay, we can do that. In fact, it might send a message about your intentions. That afternoon, I walked into a different bank across town. Not the friendly community bank where Robert and I had done our business for years, but a larger regional bank where nobody knew me or my story. I opened a new savings account in my name only and transferred the entire $400,000. The young bank manager, probably in his 30s, processed the transaction professionally without asking any questions about why a widow was moving such a large sum. But I wasn't done. I had been thinking about Margaret's forum post, about choosing between keeping my money and keeping the peace. The truth was, there had never been any peace to keep. Thomas, Carol, and James had decided months ago that they were entitled to my money. They had never offered me the choice of a peaceful resolution, only the choice between giving them what they wanted or being branded as selfish and greedy. My second stop was the real estate office. Linda Summers had sold Robert and me our house 15 years ago, and she still worked in the same office. When I told her I wanted to put the house on the market, her eyebrows shot up. Helen, are you sure about this? It's been such a short time since Robert passed. Maybe you should wait a year before making big decisions. Linda, I've been getting advice about waiting and thinking and not making hasty decisions for 4 months now, I said. What I've learned is that the people giving me that advice are the same people who want to control what I do with my life and my money. I'm 63, not 93. I'm capable of making my own decisions. The house was worth approximately $280,000. Robert and I had paid off the mortgage 3 years earlier, so it was free and clear. Like the savings account, it was titled jointly with rights of survivorship, which meant it was entirely mine now. But I knew that if I kept living in it, the children would find ways to make it part of their ongoing pressure campaign. Carol would keep showing up unannounced. Thomas would keep calculating how much equity I was hoarding that should rightfully belong to them. James would keep talking about what his father would have wanted. But if I sold it on my own terms, used the proceeds to buy myself a smaller place that had never been Robert's, I could create a clean slate, a fresh start that had nothing to do with inheritance or family drama or guilt about what I owed to anyone. The real estate market was strong. Linda assured me that we could probably sell within 60 days, maybe sooner if we priced it competitively. Where are you thinking of moving? She asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. Maybe somewhere smaller, easier to maintain. Maybe somewhere warmer. Maybe somewhere where nobody knows about my family situation. That evening, I called Patricia to let her know about my decisions. She was quiet for a moment after I explained about moving the money and listing the house. Mom, that's that's actually brilliant, she finally said. You're not just protecting your assets, you're taking control of the entire narrative. They can't accuse you of hiding money that you've legally moved to your own account. They can't demand a share of house equity that you've converted to cash and used to build your own future. I just got tired of defending myself, I told her. I realized that I was spending all my energy trying to justify keeping what was already mine instead of focusing on what I wanted to do with my life. You know that feeling when you stop playing defense and start playing offense? Everything changes. Instead of reacting to their demands and accusations, I was making proactive decisions about my own future. Instead of trying to preserve a status quo that was making me miserable, I was creating something new. The family's reaction to my decisions was swift and predictable. Carol drove by the house and saw the for sale sign 2 days after it went up. She called me immediately, her voice high with panic. Helen, what are you doing? You can't sell Dad's house without discussing it with us. Carol, this is my house, I said calmly. Robert and I owned it together, and now I own it alone. I don't need to discuss my housing decisions with anyone. But where are you going to live? What are you going to do with the money from the sale? I'm going to do whatever I decide to do with it, I replied, just like I'm doing whatever I decide to do with our savings account. There was a long silence. You moved the money. I moved my money, yes. Helen, this is escalating unnecessarily. We just want to talk, to work something out that's fair for everyone. Carol, we've been talking for 4 months. You've made it very clear what you think is fair. I disagree. That weekend, all three children showed up at my house together. Thomas was carrying a manila folder again, but this time he looked less confident than he had during our first confrontation. James looked angry and Carol looked hurt. Helen, we need to talk about what you're doing, Thomas began. No, we don't, I said, not inviting them to sit down. What I'm doing is legal, ethical, and none of your business. I'm a grown woman making decisions about my own life and my own assets. But you're making it impossible for us to work out a reasonable compromise, Carol protested. There is no reasonable compromise, I replied. You want half of the money Robert and I saved together, and I'm not giving it to you. That's not a negotiation. That's me saying no to an unreasonable demand. James finally exploded. This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child who won't share her toys. No, James, I'm acting like a widow who won't be bullied by her stepchildren. There's a difference. The conversation continued for 20 more minutes, but nothing productive came from it. They threatened legal action again, promised to contest everything I was doing, warned me that I was destroying the family permanently. I listened to all of it with a calmness that surprised even me. After they left, I realized something important had happened. For the first time since Robert's death, I had been in complete control of a conversation with his children. I hadn't been defensive, hadn't tried to justify my decisions, hadn't sought their approval or understanding. I had simply stated my position and maintained it, regardless of their emotional manipulation or threats. The house sold faster than Linda had predicted. A young couple with two small children fell in love with the kitchen that Robert and I had renovated, the garden we had planted together, the finished basement where he had set up his workshop. They offered asking price and wanted to close within 30 days. Meanwhile, I had been quietly looking at condominiums in a town about 40 miles away. It was close enough to my old community that I could maintain friendships and continue with my volunteer work if I wanted to, but far enough away that I wouldn't run into Thomas, Carol, or James at the grocery store. The condo I chose was in a 55 and older community with a pool, a fitness center, and organized social activities. It was smaller than the house I was leaving, but it was brand new, modern, and entirely mine. The community support I found during this transition surprised me. Mrs. Patterson helped me pack, and several other neighbors offered assistance when they heard I was moving. My church friends threw me a small farewell party. Even some people who had initially seemed judgmental about the family conflict came forward to wish me well. "You know, Helen," said Mrs. Rodriguez from the church auxiliary, "my sister went through something similar when her husband died. His adult daughter tried to claim half of everything. It took 2 years of legal battles, but she finally had to accept that joint property belongs to the surviving spouse. You're doing the right thing." But the real test came when they played their final card. 3 days before I was scheduled to close on the condo, Thomas called with news that made my blood run cold. "Helen, we've filed a formal legal challenge to Dad's will and to the transfer of assets. Peterson says we have grounds to claim undue influence and mental incapacity. We're also questioning whether the joint accounts were actually intended to be joint, or whether Dad was just trying to make banking easier for both of you." Mental incapacity. They were claiming that Robert hadn't been mentally competent when he made financial decisions with me. They were going to drag his memory through a legal proceeding, questioning his judgment and his love for me in order to get access to our money. "Thomas, your father was sharp as a tack until the day he died, and you know it. That may be your opinion, but we have documentation of some confusion and memory issues in his last few years. Doctor visits, prescription changes for medications that can affect cognitive function. Peterson thinks we have a strong case." I hung up the phone and sat in my empty living room, surrounded by boxes, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet again. But then I remembered Margaret's advice about people whose opinion of me mattered, and I realized something that changed everything. What happened next surprised even me. I called Janet immediately after Thomas hung up. "They're claiming Robert was mentally incompetent," I told her, my voice steadier than I felt. "Helen, take a deep breath. This is exactly the kind of desperate move I expected once you started taking control of your assets. They're trying to scare you into settling. But what if they can prove something? What if there's medical documentation I don't know about? Then we'll deal with it. But Helen, I need you to understand something. You lived with Robert every day for 25 years. You managed finances together, made decisions together, planned together. If anyone would know about cognitive decline, it would be you. Did you ever notice any confusion about money or legal matters?" I thought carefully about Robert's last few years. Yes, he had slowed down physically. Yes, he sometimes forgot where he put his reading glasses or repeated stories he'd told me before. But confused about money? Never. He had balanced our checkbook the month before he died. He had researched and recommended the mutual fund where we moved some of our savings just 6 months before his heart attack. Janet, he was sharp about finances until the end. Whatever medical records they think they have, they're either taking them out of context or lying about what they mean. Good, then we fight back. But Helen, I need to tell you something. Fighting this could cost you $50,000 in legal fees, maybe more. Even if we win, and I believe we will, it's going to be expensive and emotionally draining. $50,000, a significant chunk of the money I was fighting to protect. But as I sat there in my empty house, surrounded by the boxes that represented my new life, I realized something important. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about whether I was going to let fear control the rest of my life. "Janet, if I give in now, if I settle just to avoid the legal fight, What message does that send to other widows facing the same situation? What message does that send to people who think they can bully women into giving up what's rightfully theirs? There was a pause. You're right. And Helen, there's something else. I've been practicing elder law for 20 years, and I've seen this pattern repeatedly. Adult children who challenge their parents' financial decisions almost never stop at one attempt. If you give them money now to make this go away, they'll be back in a few years asking for more. They'll claim you can't manage your finances alone, that you need their help, that you should be grateful for their guidance. That night, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I wasn't going to settle. I wasn't going to give them $1 to make them go away. I was going to fight their legal challenge with everything I had, and I was going to win. But first, I did something that I should have done months earlier. I started documenting everything, not just financial records, but everything. I wrote down every conversation I'd had with Thomas, Carol, and James since Robert's funeral. I saved every text message, every email, every voicemail they'd left. I documented every visit, every demand, every threat. You know that feeling when you step back and look at a pattern of behavior objectively, and you realize just how unreasonable and manipulative it's been. Reading through months of their communications was like getting a psychology lesson in emotional blackmail. They had used every tactic in the book: guilt, fear, family obligation, community pressure, financial intimidation. The legal proceedings began in earnest 3 weeks later. Peterson, their attorney, filed a formal petition claiming that Robert had lacked mental capacity during the last 2 years of his life and that I had exercised undue influence over his financial decisions. They requested that all joint accounts be frozen and that an independent administrator be appointed to manage Robert's estate. Janet's response was swift and devastating. She presented medical records showing that Robert had passed cognitive assessments during routine doctor visits right up until his final year. She provided bank records showing that financial decisions had been made jointly, with both our signatures required for major transactions. She included testimony from our financial advisor, who confirmed that Robert had been actively involved in investment decisions and had demonstrated clear understanding of complex financial concepts. But the most powerful evidence came from something I hadn't even thought of. Janet subpoenaed Robert's email account, which had been maintained by his phone provider. What she found was a series of emails between Robert and his doctor, his financial advisor, and even his insurance agent, all from the months before his death. The emails showed a man who was articulate, focused, and completely competent in all financial matters. In one email to his insurance agent, dated just 3 months before his heart attack, Robert had written, "I want to make sure Helen is completely protected if something happens to me. We've built this life together, and she deserves to enjoy the security we've created without interference from anyone else." When Janet read that email aloud during the court hearing, I had to fight back tears. Even facing his own mortality, Robert had been thinking about protecting me from exactly what his children were now putting me through. The hearing itself was surreal. Thomas, Carol, and James sat on one side of the courtroom with their attorney, while I sat on the other side with Janet. For 2 days, we listened to medical experts, financial professionals, and character witnesses testify about Robert's mental state and our relationship. The most difficult moment came when Peterson called Dr. Williams, Robert's primary care physician, to testify about medications that Robert had been taking for diabetes and heart conditions. Peterson tried to suggest that these medications could have affected Robert's cognitive function. Dr. Williams was having none of it. Mr. Thompson was one of my most compliant and engaged patients, he testified. He asked informed questions about his medications, understood their side effects, and was actively involved in managing his health conditions. I never observed any cognitive impairment or confusion about financial or legal matters. But it was the judge's questions that really revealed the weakness of their case. Judge Martinez was a woman in her 60s who had clearly seen similar family disputes before. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "are you claiming that Mr. Thompson lacked the mental capacity to manage his finances for the entire last 2 years of his life?" "Yes, Your Honor. We believe the evidence supports that conclusion." And yet, during this same period, he continued to work part-time, managed his medical care independently, and made complex investment decisions that proved financially sound. Peterson tried to argue that I had been controlling all of these decisions, but the evidence didn't support that claim. Robert's fingerprints were all over every major financial decision we'd made. The final blow came when Janet presented something that Peterson clearly hadn't expected. 6 months before Robert's death, he had written a letter to Thomas addressing exactly this kind of scenario. Robert had apparently anticipated that his children might challenge his financial arrangements with me. "Thomas," the letter read, "I know you and your siblings have concerns about how Helen and I manage our finances. I want you to understand that every decision we make is made together with full understanding of the legal and financial implications. Helen is my wife and my partner, not just in love, but in every aspect of our life together. The money we have saved belongs to both of us equally, and if something happens to me, it should belong entirely to her. This is what I want, and it's what we've planned for together." When the judge read that letter, I watched Thomas's face crumble. All their arguments about undue influence and mental incapacity fell apart in the face of Robert's own words, written in his own hand, expressing exactly the intentions that were reflected in our legal documents. Judge Martinez took less than an hour to render her decision. The evidence presented clearly shows that Mr. Thompson was mentally competent and acting of his own free will in all financial arrangements with his surviving spouse. The challenge to his estate planning is without merit and is hereby dismissed. All legal fees and court costs are to be paid by the plaintiffs. I thought I had won, but then I discovered something that made me question everything. As I was leaving the courthouse, Carol approached me alone. She looked exhausted and defeated. "Helen, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "This whole thing, the legal challenge, claiming Dad was incompetent, it wasn't my idea. Thomas convinced James and me that we needed the money, that Dad would have wanted us to have it. But I've been thinking about that letter, about what Dad actually wrote." She paused, looking around to make sure Thomas and James weren't nearby. "Dad never promised us money, Helen. He promised us love, guidance, education, opportunities, and he delivered on all of that. But Thomas has been struggling financially since his divorce, and he convinced us that we were entitled to inherit Dad's savings. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we put you through this." I stood there in the courthouse lobby, watching this woman who had tormented me for months break down in tears, and I realized something profound. The real battle hadn't been about money at all. It had been about fear, their fear of financial insecurity, my fear of being seen as selfish, everyone's fear of admitting that death changes everything and nothing is guaranteed. What I learned about family, money, and self-worth would shape the rest of my life, and it started with understanding that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who need the strongest boundaries.